Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into the kind of historical facts that might seem a little dull at first, but trust me, they'll have you relaxed and drifting off to sleep before you even realize it. These stories aren't about epic wars or legendary heroes, they're about the mundane and strange details of history that, surprisingly, make a fascinating backdrop for a good night's sleep. Imagine curling up with a cozy blanket and settling into a story about something that isn't filled with tension and drama, but instead meanders through the curious, quiet corners of the past. That's what we're doing tonight. You probably won't survive this journey without a few yawns or a light chuckle at how absurd some of these events are in hindsight. Some might even seem a bit strange or dull, but that's what makes them perfect for tonight's adventure into the past. You'll be surprised how these tiny facts can ease you into the deep sleep you've been craving. The beauty of history is in the little details that seem insignificant at first, but when told right, make you realize how far we've come. Tonight, we're embracing the history that's just as slow and gentle as your journey into sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I always find it fascinating to see how far and wide these stories travel. I bet we've got people tuning in from places I've never even heard of. I'm also a bit obsessed with time zones, so drop your location in the comments. It's kind of fun to picture you all around the world listening along. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Black Plague and the death toll. Let's start with something that might not sound all that exciting at first. The Black Plague. It might sound a bit heavy, but stick with me. The story isn't as intense as you think. The Black Plague was a deadly disease that swept across Europe in the 14th century, causing death on a scale that is almost unimaginable. Around 25 to 50 million people died from the disease in just a few years. To give you an idea of how massive that is, imagine half of the population of Europe just disappearing. For many people, the plague seemed like an unstoppable force of nature, a force that took lives as easily as a cold breeze blows a leaf off a tree. You'd think the tale of the Black Plague would be a dramatic, high-energy adventure filled with tales of brave survivors and scientists rushing to discover a cure. But in reality, the way it spread was slow and, dare I say, rather boring at times. People didn't have the fancy sanitizers or knowledge of germs that we have today. Instead, the plague spread because of fleas that lived on rats that hopped from one port to another, carrying the fleas with them. The fleas would bite the humans, and that's when the real damage started. The people didn't know what was causing it, so they were, for the most part, powerless to stop it. That's the history lesson right there. No fancy heroics, no intense chase scenes, just rats and fleas spreading disease slowly and relentlessly. It's like watching a slow-motion disaster that you can't look away from, even if you wanted to. But here's where it gets interesting. Historians still argue over the true death toll of the plague. Some say it killed more people than the official counts suggest, while others believe the death toll has been exaggerated over the centuries. Were there more victims, or was it just a case of people misjudging the numbers in the aftermath? The mystery still lingers, like a fog over the past, making us wonder just how far the devastation really reached. The sheer number of deaths and the fact that entire villages were wiped out paints a picture of a world trying to grapple with something completely out of their control. In fact, the experience was so overwhelming that it led to some changes in the way society was structured. For one, labor became a much more valuable commodity. With so many people gone, those who were still alive could demand better wages and better living conditions. It was a time of great social upheaval, though not in the way you might imagine. It wasn't a dramatic revolution. It was more like the world was quietly shifting underneath the feet of everyone who survived. But I bet you didn't expect this little twist. While many people were locking themselves away to avoid getting sick, some doctors were actually walking around in these long beak-like masks. Why? Well, they thought the disease was spread by bad air or miasma, and that the beaks would keep them from inhaling the foul-smelling air that supposedly carried the disease. Picture this: doctors walking around in robes, masks with long beaks, and gloves looking like something out of a horror movie. It's a weird visual, right? These bird doctors thought that keeping their face away from the air would protect them from disease. But what's funny is they weren't wrong in their thinking, they just didn't know how diseases were really transmitted. It was their best guess, and unfortunately, IT wasn't enough to stop the spread of the plague. You could argue that some of the measures taken to combat the Black Plague have surprisingly modern echoes. Quarantines, for example, were first implemented during the plague in the form of isolating infected individuals or entire towns. At the time, the understanding of the disease was primitive, but they knew enough to isolate the sick from the healthy. It's fascinating, isn't it? A bit of modern public health practices were being born, while people were still trying to figure out why rats were running rampant and spreading death wherever they went. And yet, despite all the horror, the Black Plague brought about some strange and unexpected changes. Towns became cleaner, the idea of sanitation started to take hold, and in the aftermath, cities started to rebuild with a stronger focus on hygiene. So in a weird way, the plague changed the course of history in a way that's almost hard to appreciate in the moment, like cleaning out a dusty old attic. It wasn't fun or glamorous, but when it was all done, the world was a little bit cleaner and more organized. So, as you settle into rest, remember this about the Black Plague. It wasn't about heroism or dramatic last-minute rescues, it was about surviving the slow march of disease and trying to make sense of it in a world that had very little idea how to handle it. And before you drift off too far, think about this. Despite all the messiness, we're here today because people survived the plague, dealt with it, and eventually learned from it. Those weird bird-masked doctors, they were early pioneers of modern medical practices, even if they didn't know it at the time.
Let's keep this sleepy journey rolling, shall we? Now that you're all comfy, let's talk about something that might make you feel just a little more relaxed. The origins of something we all encounter in life, the delightful cough syrup. Ah yes, the soothing elixir that, in Victorian times, was more about mixing up a bit of this and a little of that, with no real regard for the long-term consequences. Imagine walking into a Victorian pharmacy and being handed a bottle of medicine that included whiskey, opium and some odd herbs. Sounds like the recipe for a decent nap, but perhaps not the healthiest choice. But then again, you probably wouldn't have cared much about health if you were already feeling under the weather. Victorian-era cough syrup wasn't like the store-bought stuff we see today. Oh no. Back in the 19th century, medicinal concoctions were a lot more interesting, to say the least. The ingredients were often the same as those used to get very high, because the idea of distinguishing between medicine and recreation was a little blurry at the time. You'd walk into an apothecary and ask for something to help with your cough, and they'd hand you a bottle filled with opium tincture. Yes, opium, the same stuff used for all sorts of medicinal purposes, including pain relief, sleep, and other things. Imagine that moment of taking a sip, feeling the warmth spread through your chest, and then slowly realizing that you weren't just curing your cold, you were probably entering a very deep sleep for the next several hours. Now let's talk a bit about why this strange concoction was so popular. In the absence of modern medicine, people turned to whatever they thought would work, and back then opium was a serious go-to. Opium poppies had been around for centuries, and the Victorians were not shy about using them, whether it was for coughs, pain relief, or just to help you sleep. It was pretty common to see people with a bottle of laudanum tucked away in their pockets. In fact, laudanum, the opium-based tincture, was available for purchase without a prescription. Imagine walking into a store and buying a substance that could easily knock you out for hours. It's the sort of thing that would definitely make a modern pharmacist break out in a cold sweat. But of course, that's the thing. Back then, there wasn't a whole lot of regulation. People didn't have a real understanding of addiction or the long-term effects of their medicinal habits. While some people might have been using it to ease pain or get a better night's sleep, Others were unknowingly developing a serious dependence. Historians still debate whether the widespread use of opium in Victorian times was a blessing or a curse. For many, it provided temporary relief from the stresses of the day, but for others, it became a dangerous crutch. And while we're on the subject of intoxicating substances, let's take a moment to picture what it must have been like to be in an apothecary in the 1800s. The air probably smelled of strange herbs and pungent chemicals, nothing like the antiseptic smell of a modern drugstore. And just imagine the apothecary standing behind the counter mixing up a concoction that might cure a cough or make you forget you ever had one. The thought of someone handing you a bottle of liquid opium and telling you it's good for what ails you is downright bizarre, yet it was the reality for many people back then. It's a little terrifying to think that the Victorians probably didn't have a clue just how harmful their treatments could be in the long run, but they did have a lot of interesting ideas, to say the least. Speaking of bizarre ideas, let's talk about the man who gave us the phrase, "an apple a day keeps the doctor away." This might sound like a charming little saying, but it actually has roots in something a little darker. The Victorians weren't all about healthful eating, they were also about quirky fads, and one of them involved the use of something even stranger than laudanum, crocodile dung. Yes, you read that correctly. For some strange reason, Victorian women, and even some men, would mix up a potion that included crocodile excrement, believing it had healing properties. As if that wasn't enough, they would apply this medicine to their faces, thinking it would cure wrinkles and keep them looking youthful. A real beauty treatment, right? Just a little dab of crocodile poop and you'd be set for life. If that doesn't make you want to curl up and shut your eyes, I don't know what will. The idea of walking around with a little jar of crocodile dung in your purse is just absurd enough to make you realise how far we've come in the world of skincare and medicine. But what's even crazier is that these kinds of bizarre treatments were taken seriously by many people. Historians still argue over how seriously these remedies were embraced. Some believe they were seen as genuine cures, while others think they were just another fad that people followed for the sake of social status. Either way, the idea that someone could have put crocodile poop on their face and thought it was good for their skin is enough to make you shake your head. Now, while we're laughing at some of these bizarre historical remedies, it's important to remember that they were often born out of a lack of understanding. People didn't have the scientific knowledge we have today, and they had to rely on whatever worked, no matter how weird or questionable it seemed. What might seem ridiculous now was once considered the cutting edge of healthcare. It makes you grateful for modern medicine, doesn't it? It's almost hard to believe that a time when crocodile dung was seen as a beauty aid could be a real part of history, but it is. This was the world that the Victorians lived in. And as you settle into sleep, think about this. Back in the day, they didn't have the luxury of easy, reliable medications. Instead, they had their own peculiar ways of coping with illness. Whether it was a shot of whiskey and opium or the latest beauty treatment involving animal waste, people made do with what they had. It's a strange, almost funny chapter in history, but it also makes you appreciate the modern world we live in today, where we can take something for a cough without worrying about accidentally passing out for the next 6 hours. As we continue our sleepy journey into the past, let's move on to something a bit more personal, romance, but not the kind of romance you'd expect. No, tonight we're diving into the peculiar and slightly sad side of Napoleon Bonaparte's love life. Picture this. A man who rose from humble beginnings to become Emperor of France, but even he couldn't quite get the love life thing right. Napoleon's love for his first wife, Josephine, was as intense and complicated as you might imagine, but it's also the kind of romantic tale that might leave you more bewildered than swooning. Napoleon's obsession with Josephine is legendary. At first, their relationship seemed like a match made in history. Josephine was beautiful, charming, and like Napoleon, came from a somewhat tumultuous past. She had been married before and even had children, but it was Napoleon who swept her off her feet and made her the Empress of France. But here's where things get weird. Despite their intense passion for each other, their relationship was filled with tension, jealousy, and separation. Napoleon, a man who could conquer entire nations, was unable to conquer the one thing he truly wanted, Josephine's heart. He would write her letters filled with the kind of devotion that might make you roll your eyes and think, "Get a grip, Napoleon." Yet, at the same time, he was constantly worried that Josephine wasn't quite as committed as he was. So much for the man of steel, right? Historians still argue whether Napoleon's obsessive nature towards Josephine was a true sign of love or just his need to control everything around him. His letters to her were filled with romantic declarations, sometimes in the same sentence as complaints about how much he missed her, or how much she wasn't living up to his expectations. This constant back and forth between intense love and frustration was a hallmark of their relationship on ship. And, to make matters more complicated, Josephine had affairs of her own. These affairs were often public, and Napoleon, despite his best efforts to stay calm, could never quite shake the suspicion that Josephine's heart was drifting away. Ironically, while he was busy conquering empires, he couldn't keep Josephine's affections from slipping through his fingers. Eventually, Napoleon and Josephine divorced. It wasn't because they stopped loving each other, quite the opposite actually. The problem was that Josephine couldn't give Napoleon an heir, and in the world of 19th century politics, that was a serious issue. Napoleon married again, but it wasn't the same. His second wife, Marie Louise of Austria, may have given him the heir he so desperately wanted, but the relationship was far less passionate. After all, how do you follow up a romance that could have been written by a Shakespearean playwright, full of intense love, jealousy, and heartbreak? Napoleon was a conqueror in every sense, except when it came to Josephine, the one woman he couldn't truly possess. So, while Napoleon may have been a brilliant strategist on the battlefield, his love life was something else entirely. It wasn't grand gestures or heroic declarations. It was more like a series of misunderstandings, unmet expectations, and a lot of emotional turmoil. But there's something about his devotion to Josephine, despite everything, that's almost endearing in its own tragic way. It's like watching a person chase a dream they can never quite catch, but they keep running, hoping that one day it'll be different. It's interesting to think about how love and ambition were interwoven in Napoleon's life. Here's a man who could conquer armies, reshape Europe, and create an empire that would leave a lasting mark on history. And yet, when it came to the one thing he seemed to truly desire, unwavering love, he couldn't quite hold on to it. Maybe in a way, his obsession with Josephine was a reflection of the larger empire he was trying to build. Constantly expanding, always striving, but ultimately always yearning for something just out of reach. It's a romantic tragedy wrapped in military strategy. And as you relax into your bed, drifting off with Napoleon's story floating in your mind, think about this. How many people, like Napoleon, chase something just out of their grasp? Whether it's love, success, or happiness, the chase is often what defines us, even if we don't always win the race. Sometimes the journey is as important, if not more important, than the destination. And in Napoleon's case, maybe that was true in both love and war. While Napoleon's heart may have been lost to Josephine, and his ambitions would ultimately lead him to an exile far from the grandeur of his empire, his passion for her is what makes his story so interesting. It's a reminder that even the most powerful figures in history, the ones who shape the world, are still just human, prone to the same flaws and desires as anyone else. So as you begin to drift further into sleep, remember, Napoleon wasn't just a conqueror, he was a man with a heart full of complicated love, struggling to balance his personal desires with the demands of an empire. And sometimes even the greatest of us can't quite control everything we want. Alright, let's keep this flow going as you slowly ease into the peaceful comfort of your bed. Next up, we're going to discuss something that most of us can relate to, the invention of the first known alarm clock. You know, the kind of alarm clock that gets you up when you'd rather stay buried in your sheets, safe from the day ahead. But trust me, the original version of the alarm clock wasn't anything like the peaceful, snoozable gadgets we use today. It wasn't digital. It didn't have a soft, comforting beep. Oh no, it was a far more intimate experience. Imagine having a tiny human being literally bang a metal bell next to your ear to wake you up. What a way to start the day, right? This particular alarm clock wasn't made by some brilliant inventor who thought, let's make something nice and soothing. Instead, the first alarm clocks were created by the sheer necessity of getting up at a certain time in the morning. Back in the 18th century, there was no snooze button, no gentle music to stir you from sleep. If you were a poor worker, you often didn't have the luxury of getting up when it was convenient. You had to get up when the bell told you to. The bell that was usually someone else's responsibility to ring for you. Yes, before mechanical alarm clocks, some people had human alarms, which were basically employed bell ringers. These human alarm clocks had one job: to bang a bell as loud as possible, ensuring that no one would ever have the chance to roll over for just 5 more minutes of sleep. Can you imagine that? You're lying in bed, hoping for just a little more rest, and suddenly, bang, 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 a bell is ringing just inches from your ear. It's as if the world decided to throw a bucket of cold water in your face, forcing you out of bed whether you liked it or not. It wasn't so much a gentle nudge as it was a full-body wake-up call. But here's the kick. This method of waking up actually stuck around for a while. People would use these loud, unforgiving bells until mechanical versions of alarm clocks started being made later on, around the early 19th century. The first mechanical alarm clock wasn't exactly a peaceful creation either. It was just a big, loud metal bell that would ring at a predetermined time. You didn't get to pick your wake-up time. If you were lucky, you might have the option of setting it to go off within a 15-minute window, but that was about it. So if you were someone who liked to wake up gently, this was a nightmare. Imagine being startled from a deep sleep by the loud clanging of a bell, with no chance of turning over and drifting back off. But it wasn't just poor workers who were stuck with this method of waking up. Even Napoleon Bonaparte himself, despite all of his military genius, had a less than dramatic morning routine. Napoleon, who rose at 5 a.m. every day to get a head start on the world, used a mechanical alarm clock to ensure he didn't sleep in. But it wasn't all serene and composed like his well-dressed public image suggested. No, the alarm clock likely rang so loud and obnoxiously that even the Emperor of France had to jolt awake like the rest of us. It makes you think, no matter how powerful or important someone was, they too had to wrestle with the basic human need to be pulled out of their dreams by something far less graceful than we might imagine. Now, there's a little scholarly debate here about whether these bells were actually effective alarm clocks. Historians still argue whether this loud, harsh wake-up method was a necessary evil or simply a quirk of historical innovation that was long overdue for an upgrade. But the fact remains that these early mechanical alarms were loud, brutish, and about as subtle as a freight train. If anything, they're a reminder that progress, even in the realm of basic everyday conveniences, often comes with a few bumps along the way. Just think, before the snooze button and calming alarm sounds, people had to endure the relentless, unforgiving sound of metal bells to get out of bed. Can you imagine the dread of knowing your morning started not with a soft ding, but with an industrial clang? It might have been more effective in waking people up, but it sure wasn't a good way to start the day on a relaxed note. And let's be real, alarm clocks have come a long way since then, but we still haven't fully figured out how to make waking up something pleasant. Sure, we've moved on from the bell-ringing barbarity of early alarms, but we're still wrestling with the harsh, shrill sounds of the modern alarm. Some of us might even resort to setting up multiple alarms, knowing full well that snooze buttons can be just as cruel as those ancient bells. In a way, we're still dealing with the same battle, the struggle to wake up when we're not ready. Sure, we can now choose a melody or even play soothing sounds, but waking up is never quite as peaceful as we want it to be. It's a funny thing to think about as you settle into your bed tonight. The first alarm clocks were designed with efficiency in mind, not comfort. They were all about ensuring that you'd get up and get to work, whether you were ready for it or not. No luxury, no gentle transition. It's like the world was saying, you need to be awake now, and we don't care how it happens. We've come a long way since then, but the struggle of waking up is still something that connects us all. After all, no matter how much we try to avoid it, we all have to face the morning in one way or another. So, as you start to relax and feel your eyes getting heavier, think about how far we've come with our alarm clocks. From those clanging bells to the gentle melodies we hear today, it's all about waking up in a way that works for each of us. Sure, it's not perfect, but hey, at least we don't have to listen to someone banging on a bell to make sure we're up and ready for the day. Let that thought settle in as you drift deeper into sleep, because tonight you're the one who gets to wake up on your own terms. No bells necessary. Now that you're nice and cozy, let's explore a whole new level of strangeness with the Victorian era. The Victorians were experts in many things, but one of their most bizarre and fascinating practices was their obsession with mourning. You might think, okay, a somber ceremony here and there, sure, that makes sense. But no, Victorian mourning was an entire culture unto itself. This was a time when people didn't just dress in black for a week or two after a loved one passed away. Oh no, this went way deeper, with elaborate customs and social expectations that made mourning a whole lifestyle. If you were part of Victorian society, you had to mourn correctly, or else. The first thing to know about Victorian mourning is that it was serious business. When someone died, it wasn't just about the immediate family grieving. Society had rules, and there were proper ways to mourn, depending on your relationship with the deceased, your social standing, and even your gender. Let's be clear, the Victorian mourning process could take months. Yes, months. The length of time you spent in mourning depended on how closely you were related to the deceased, and let me tell you, it wasn't a relaxing, tear-filled period of reflection. It was a ritualistic, socially structured event that had you following a set of strict rules for how to dress, behave, and even think. Let's start with the most notable part of mourning, the clothing. People didn't just throw on something black and call it a day. No, there was a strict hierarchy of mourning clothes. For example, if you were mourning a spouse, you had to wear black for a full year and a day, and your clothing had to be completely devoid of any ornamentation. No lace, no frills, just somber, plain black. It didn't end there. After that year of plain black, you'd enter a secondary phase of mourning where you could start wearing grey or purple but only after making sure the clothing was just as subdued and unadorned. It was like being trapped in a perpetual state of sadness, forced to wear your grief for the world to see. And remember, this wasn't a casual affair. It was expected. You couldn't just decide to skip it. Society was watching, and you had to play by the rules. But the clothing was just the start. The Victorians took mourning to an extreme that might make you laugh if it weren't so incredibly bizarre. People would wear black veils that completely covered their faces, sometimes even in public, so that no one could see their expressions, just a symbol of mourning hanging in front of them like a curtain. Women in particular were expected to wear these veils when attending funerals, while men had their own set of rules, though not quite as elaborate. But it wasn't just about covering your face with fabric. No, they took it a step further and created mourning jewellery, often made from the hair of the deceased. Yes, you read that right. Mourning jewellery often contained human hair. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was a deeply ingrained practice of the time. People would turn their loved one's hair into intricate pieces of jewellery, brooches, rings, necklaces, and wear them as a constant reminder of the person they had lost. In fact, it was considered quite fashionable and respectable to wear these hair-based pieces of jewellery during mourning. But here's the real kicker. If you were particularly fashionable, you might also create a small memorial out of your loved one's belongings. It could be a keepsake box or even an urn decorated with their personal effects. Imagine being a guest at a Victorian dinner party and seeing someone casually wearing a brooch made from their late husband's hair. It's the sort of thing that would probably make you pause for a moment and wonder just how deep the mourning process really went. It wasn't just about grief, it was about showing the world how much you mourned. It was a social statement as much as it was a personal one. And while all of this might seem a bit too much, there was something oddly fascinating about the sheer dedication to the rituals of mourning. The Victorians didn't just mourn, they turned it into an art form, a public display of emotion and decorum. If you were truly going to grieve, you had to grieve properly. Your mourning process wasn't just for you, it was for everyone around you to witness. After all, in the rigid social structure of the time, your behaviour was constantly being judged, and failing to show the correct amount of grief was considered distasteful, even disrespectful. So as strange as it may seem, mourning became an important part of social identity in Victorian society. Interestingly, the Victorian obsession with mourning even affected how people thought about death. It wasn't just about the act of grieving, it was about preparing for it. The Victorians had a much more hands-on approach to the afterlife. Many people had elaborate funeral preparations, often including things like elaborate headstones, memorials, and even mourning parties, where friends and family would gather to mourn together in a prescribed manner. The entire process was as structured as any other aspect of Victorian life, and it played a huge role in the culture of the time. But as you drift deeper into sleep, remember this. As odd and extreme as the Victorian mourning customs might seem, they were an important part of the time's approach to life and death. The rituals may have been over the top, but they were rooted in a belief that death was a serious, almost sacred part of life. It wasn't something to be hidden away or avoided. It was something to be honoured, remembered, and showcased. And in a way, that focus on death created a unique way of living, where the boundaries between life and death were constantly blurred, and where the remembrance of the departed was just as important as the lives of the living. As you let this strange piece of history float through your mind, think about how much we take for granted today. Sure, we don't wear mourning jewellery made from human hair, but we still have our own ways of coping with loss. Ways that in some strange way reflect the same care and respect for those we've lost. The Victorians might have gone a bit overboard with their mourning practices, but they also showed us that grief is a deeply personal and at times very public process. It's part of the human experience, something we all share no matter how different the details may seem. As you sink deeper into relaxation, let's continue down our winding path through history, moving from the very public grief of the Victorians to the truly bizarre and utterly strange medieval remedies that were used to treat almost anything. Now, when I say medieval remedies, I'm not talking about the kind of medicine we're used to, where you pop a pill or go to a doctor's office for a prescription. Oh no. The medieval approach to health was a bit more, shall we say, creative. They didn't have antibiotics, vaccines, or even a reliable understanding of germs. What they had instead were things like leeches, crushed frogs, and brace yourself, human urine. Yes, you heard that right. These were the things medieval doctors and healers relied on to treat diseases. And no, they didn't question it much. The weirder, the better, apparently. Let's start with one of the most infamous of medieval treatments, leeches. Leeches were actually used for centuries, right up until the 19th century in fact, as a common remedy for a variety of ailments. The idea was that these little bloodsuckers would suck the bad blood out of the body and restore balance. Now, whether or not this was effective is still debated. Historians and doctors alike are divided on whether leeching was a genuine health benefit or just a way to bleed people dry, literally and figuratively. People believed that many illnesses, from headaches to fevers, were caused by an imbalance in the body's humours. So, the treatment was simple. Take a leech, let it latch onto your skin, and hope it would suck out whatever was wrong with you. You'd think the idea of having a bunch of tiny creatures suck on your blood would have been enough to make people question the whole thing, but nope. Leeches were seen as miracle workers, even if they didn't actually cure anything. In fact, there was a belief that the more leeches you could et, the better you'd feel. So the next time you're feeling under the weather, you can thank medieval medicine for teaching us how not to treat a cold. But it gets even stranger. If you thought leeches were bad, wait until you hear about crushed frogs. Yes, these were often used in various medical treatments, and their popularity surged during the medieval period. Crushed frogs were believed to be effective in curing everything from warts to headaches. People thought that the secret to the frog's power lay in its skin and secretions. There was something magical about that amphibian, it seemed. One particularly delightful recipe called for mixing frog juice with honey and applying it to the affected area. Imagine walking around with frog slime on your skin, convinced it was the cure for your ailments. It's hard to imagine, but these practices were common at the time, especially when people were desperate for a cure and didn't have access to modern medicine. And while we're on the topic of strange cures, let's talk about one of the most, let's say, unappetizing remedies of all, human urine. Yes, urine, specifically the urine of young boys, was believed to have healing properties. Medieval healers and practitioners would recommend using urine as a wash for wounds, as a remedy for skin infections, and even to help with eye problems. To make matters worse, this wasn't just any old urine, it had to be fresh. The idea was that young boys' urine had magic properties, probably just because it was considered cleaner than the urine of adults. People would even use it to clean their teeth, believing it would keep them white and healthy. While modern medicine might scoff at such a bizarre treatment, at the time it was taken very seriously. Historians still argue over just how widespread these strange remedies were. Some believe that these practices were followed by the common folk, while others argue that they were part of a more elite and learned tradition of medieval healing. Either way, what's clear is that these strange cures were used by many, even though they didn't actually work. It's a bit like how we sometimes follow trends today without really understanding the science behind them. Except back then, it was all about hoping that these bizarre practices would work, even when there was no real evidence to back them up. The crazy thing is, some of these remedies were so entrenched in society that they continued to be used for centuries. The idea of putting a frog on your forehead for a headache may sound insane to us, but for people at the time, it was just another way to deal with the struggles of daily life. What's even stranger is that these kinds of medieval remedies didn't just pop up from nowhere. They were based on a combination of superstition, ancient beliefs, and the limited scientific knowledge of the time. In the medieval world, illness was often seen as the result of supernatural forces, like evil spirits, bad luck, or even curses. This is where the concept of using unusual ingredients, like frogs, urine, and even animal parts, came from. These remedies were believed to have mystical powers that could cure everything from fever to bad spirits. In a way, it was less about healing and more about combating the forces of nature or the supernatural that were seen as causing the illness. So, as you let these strange medieval remedies wash over you, consider this. While modern medicine is undoubtedly more effective and much less gross, the medieval period was a time when people had to make do with what they had. Their approach to health wasn't rooted in science, but in trial, error, and a hefty dose of superstition. Yet, strangely enough, some of these bizarre treatments helped pave the way for more modern scientific exploration. They didn't get everything right, but they were learning, experimenting, and pushing the boundaries of what they knew, however misguided it may seem to us now. And in a weird way, that's comforting to think about as you close your eyes. The world of medicine has come a long way, and so have we. As you settle deeper into your bed, consider how far we've come from crushed frogs and leeches to the medicine we use today. It's easy to forget that every great advancement in human history has had its quirky, sometimes bizarre moments. And in a way, the strange history of medieval remedies reminds us how much progress we've made and how sometimes the things that seem the strangest are what get us thinking in new directions. As you settle deeper into your sleep, let's leave behind the absurdity of medieval remedies and head into another historical oddity, one that might just leave you chuckling to yourself as you drift further into your dreams. Today, we're going to look at one of the strangest episodes in Australian history, the Great Emu War. That's right, you heard me, an actual war fought against emus. Now, this wasn't the kind of battle you'd expect from a typical war. No, this was a battle between soldiers and the feathered creatures that ended with one side winning, and it wasn't the soldiers. In 1932, after World War I, Australian farmers were struggling with an unusual enemy, emus. These large, flightless birds had a tendency to wander onto farms, causing destruction to crops that the farmers desperately relied on. Australia's farmers had endured harsh conditions, but this was the final straw. The emus seemed to be everywhere, pecking their way through wheat crops in Western Australia, and the farmers were losing the battle for survival. So, what do you do when faced with such a terrifying adversary? Well, naturally, you call in the army. It was, after all, the only logical choice. So, the military sent soldiers armed with machine guns to deal with the problem. They expected this would be a quick and easy job. After all, how could a bunch of birds, no matter how big they were, stand up to soldiers with guns? The military was sure that the emus would soon be a thing of the past. But, as you might guess, things didn't quite go as planned. In fact, it's fair to say the war didn't go very well for the soldiers at all. The first problem was that emus are surprisingly fast. They can run at speeds of up to 30 miles per hour, so as the soldiers opened fire on the birds, the emus simply scattered in all directions, evading the bullets with remarkable agility. It turns out that shooting at a flock of emus is much harder than it looks, especially when the birds are spread out over vast, open fields. Despite the soldiers' best efforts, they couldn't make much of a dent in the emu population. In fact, the birds appeared to be winning the war. In some cases, the soldiers' machine guns jammed, and even when they managed to hit their targets, the emus often didn't fall easily. Many of the birds managed to escape, and the soldiers were left shaking their heads at the failure of their military tactics. But that's not even the most absurd part of this tale. After a few weeks of what could only be described as a frustrating and embarrassing attempt to defeat a bunch of birds, the military decided to call it quits. The emus had won. In the end, the soldiers withdrew, defeated not by a foreign army or a strategic enemy, but by birds with an excellent sense of direction and speed. In total, the soldiers killed only around 1,000 emus, while the total emu population was estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands. The whole episode became a source of national embarrassment. The media in Australia had a field day with the story, calling it the Great Emu War, and laughing at the ridiculousness of the entire situation. In hindsight, the entire thing seems more like a slapstick comedy than a historical event. But it's also a reminder of how, sometimes, things don't always go according to plan. No matter how prepared you think you are, life and emus can throw you curveballs that leave you scratching your head. Historians still argue over the significance of the Great Emu War. Was it a serious failure of military strategy, or just an absurd footnote in history? Some say it was a warning about underestimating nature, while others think it was just a bizarre chapter in the annals of Australian history that was doomed from the start. But regardless of how it's viewed, there's no denying that the Great Emu War holds a special place in the list of strange historical events. As you let that image of soldiers futilely chasing emus dance through your mind, remember that sometimes history is full of the unexpected. The things we think will be easy can turn into something completely out of our control, and sometimes the forces we least expect, like a flightless bird, end up winning the day. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? But here's the kicker. Even though the soldiers lost the battle, the emus didn't exactly win in the long run. The government eventually took more pragmatic steps to deal with the birds, including offering farmers bounties to kill them. The emu population was controlled, but the memory of the Great Emu War lived on, reminding everyone that sometimes history is stranger and more comical than we could ever imagine. As you start to drift deeper into your sleep, picture those emus running through the fields, outrunning soldiers who were armed and ready for a fight. Picture the sheer absurdity of the whole situation. Maybe in your dreams you can imagine what would have happened if the emus had truly decided to fight back in the most dramatic way possible. Perhaps in some alternate universe, the Great Emu War became a legendary tale of avian triumph filled with epic battles and dramatic speeches from the emu generals. In the world of strange history, this one ranks as a true masterpiece of absurdity, but it's also a reminder that not everything goes according to plan, and sometimes the most unexpected things end up making history. So, as you let this bizarre episode wash over you, take comfort in knowing that even in the strangest of situations, life has a way of surprising us. Just remember, you may face a battle of your own in the future. Hopefully, it won't involve emus. As you relax and continue to sink into the comfort of your sleep, we're going to hop over to another historical quirk, this time to ancient Rome, where hygiene was, shall we say, a little unconventional. In modern times, we're accustomed to daily showers and soap, not to mention the cleanliness standards that we've come to expect. But in ancient Rome, well, let's just say they had a different idea of personal hygiene. They didn't have our fancy soaps or shampoos, and the notion of using water to clean themselves wasn't exactly a top priority. Instead, they turned to something a little greasier. Rather than soap, the Romans used olive oil to clean their bodies. Yes, olive oil. The same thing you drizzle on your salad or dip your bread into at dinner was the main cleaning agent in the Roman world. They would slather their bodies with this oily substance, then scrape it off with a tool called a strigil. The strigil was a curved metal instrument that looked a bit like a small, flat sword. After rubbing the oil all over their skin, the Romans would use the strigil to scrape off the oil, along with any dirt, sweat, and, well, bodily fluids. It was an odd process, but apparently it worked for them. And if you think about it, olive oil is a pretty effective moisturizer, so the Romans were at least doing something right. But wait, this wasn't just a practice reserved for the rich. Public baths were all the rage in ancient Rome, and these bathhouses were packed with people of all social classes. The bathhouse was a central part of Roman life, not just for hygiene, but as a social gathering spot. It was where business deals were made, gossip was exchanged, and people went to relax. For the Romans, taking a bath was an event. But it wasn't just about getting clean. Oh no, it was a whole ritual. There were various stages involved. You'd start with a dip in the warm water, then proceed to the strigil for your oil and scrape routine, and finish off by soaking in a cool pool to close your pores. It was the Roman equivalent of a spa day, minus the relaxation aspect. More than anything, it was about cleansing the body and the soul, because in their minds, a clean body meant a clean spirit. Interestingly, while this process might sound strange to us, it was actually more effective than it first appears. The oil would lift dirt from the skin, and the scraping motion helped exfoliate and remove dead skin cells. While it may not have been the most efficient method of cleaning, it was certainly better than nothing. Plus, the Romans had no concept of germs or bacteria, so their cleaning rituals were based on a whole different set of ideas. But it's funny to think that while we're all about scrubbing ourselves clean with soap and hot water, the Romans were just sliding around in olive oil, scraping it off like some sort of bizarre spa treatment. But hygiene in ancient Rome didn't stop at the body. They were also very focused on oral hygiene, although they used some methods that would likely make us cringe today. The Romans would clean their teeth with a mixture of crushed bones, oyster shells, and charcoal. While it might not have been the minty freshness we know today, it did get the job done, sort of. In fact, some scholars believe that the Romans' dental hygiene practices weren't as bad as we think, because the materials they used actually had some abrasive properties which helped remove plaque and food particles from their teeth. However, I wouldn't recommend trying this at home. Getting your hands on some oyster shells and crushed bone might be a little tricky, not to mention unpleasant. But there's another side to Roman hygiene that we don't always think about, their public bathrooms. Now, this isn't just any bathroom. These were massive communal latrines where people would sit next to each other, going about their business in complete public view. Imagine it, a long row of stone seats, all lined up next to each other, with no privacy whatsoever. There were no partitions, no individual stalls, just a long open space where people would sit and chat while they did their thing. If you thought public restrooms today were uncomfortable, just imagine trying to have a conversation with your neighbour while you're both, well, busy. And don't even get me started on the toilet paper. The Romans didn't have soft, disposable toilet paper like we do today. Instead, they used a sponge on a stick, which was kept in a container of water to rinse it off after each use. That's right, communal sponges. So as you drift deeper into your slumber, just remember that some things have gotten a lot better over the centuries. It's a whole different world now. Still, despite the rather unappealing nature of their hygiene habits, the Romans did have an advanced understanding of public health for their time. They built aqueducts to bring fresh water into the cities, and they had complex sewage systems to remove waste. In fact, their engineering feats when it came to water management were so advanced that some of their aqueducts are still in use today. So while their methods might seem a little questionable, they were far ahead of many other civilizations in terms of infrastructure and sanitation. The Romans may not have known about germs, but they understood the importance of clean water and the removal of waste. In a strange way they lived and kept their cities clean laid the foundation for modern sanitation systems. So, as you rest easy tonight, think about the Romans and their unique approach to cleanliness. In many ways, their practices were more about ritual than practicality, but they paved the way for some of the basic concepts we still use today. After all, we've come a long way from scrubbing our bodies with olive oil and sitting side by side in a communal latrine. The next time you step into your nice private shower, you might just want to take a moment to appreciate how far hygiene has come and how lucky we are to have it a bit more civilized. Let's now take a little detour to another strange and unsettling part of history, poisoning. The ancient and medieval worlds had an intense fascination with poisons, often using them to solve all sorts of problems, from political assassination to family drama. But the thing is, this wasn't always the straightforward, sneaky person poisons a drink kind of situation. No, these poisonings were elaborate affairs, with deadly concoctions that took time to perfect and sometimes years to act. Imagine that, a slow and methodical way of getting rid of your enemies or rivals. No quick and easy fixes here, just a long, drawn-out affair where your unfortunate victim could end up suffering for days before the poison did its grim work. In the case of ancient Rome and the Middle Ages, poisoning wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a skill, Poisoners were often seen as experts, and they were called upon by the elite to help them get rid of political adversaries or even troublesome spouses. Some rulers were so paranoid about being poisoned themselves that they would insist on having their food tested for toxins before they ate it, as though they were living in a constant state of terror. Can you imagine being that suspicious of everyone around you? If you thought you were safe in your royal court, you'd be wrong. Everyone had a reason to see you go, and what better way to do that than a little discreet poisoning? After all, it wasn't like you could just fire someone in the 1500s, right? One of the most famous figures associated with poisoning in ancient history was none other than Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Emperor Nero. Agrippina is said to have poisoned her husband, Emperor Claudius, in order to ensure that her son Nero would take the throne. It wasn't a quick act. Historians believe she used a slow-acting poison, perhaps even combined with a bit of the surprise Fulgdumna actor to carry out her plan. But here's the twist: the poison didn't work quickly enough, so Agrippina allegedly decided to speed things along by ordering that Claudius be suffocated. Talk about taking matters into your own hands. But if you think Agrippina was just a one-off case of poison used for power, think again. Poison was a common tool in the medieval courts as well. In fact, it was one of the easiest ways to get rid of a problematic king or nobleman. But the thing with poisoning is that it wasn't always easy to pull off. It had to be done right. Too much poison, and the victim would die too quickly, raising suspicion. Too little, and the victim might survive long enough to figure out what happened. So poisoners had to be subtle, almost artistically skilled in their methods. Some would use things like arsenic, a slow-acting poison that causes a range of symptoms, starting with nausea, vomiting and abdominal pain, and eventually leading to death. Imagine having to sit through that kind of agony, waiting for the inevitable end to come. The psychological toll would have been almost as bad as the physical symptoms. It wasn't just about politics either. Poisoning could be personal. One of the most infamous examples is the story of Lucrezia Borgia, who is often accused of using poison to eliminate various political rivals, enemies, and even family members. The Borgia family, with their notorious reputation for intrigue and manipulation, has often been associated with using poisons as part of their everyday lives. But whether or not Lucrezia personally administered these poisons is still a topic of debate. Some historians argue that she was more a pawn in her family's game than a true villainess. But one thing is for certain: the Borgia family's name became synonymous with intrigue, and they didn't shy away from the use of poison as a tool to get what they wanted. But here's the twist. Poisoning wasn't just a tool of the rich and powerful. Oh no, it trickled down to the lower classes too. In fact, peasants and common folk would often use poisons in their own way, usually in cases of infidelity or disputes within families. Imagine using poison to settle a fight with a neighbour over a patch of land, or to get rid of a spouse who was getting a little too comfortable. The idea of poisoning someone you didn't like wasn't reserved for monarchs and emperors. It was, unfortunately, part of the fabric of everyday life for many in the medieval and early modern periods. Historians still argue over how common the use of poison actually was. Some say it was an everyday occurrence, as easy to obtain as a loaf of bread. Others claim that poisoning was a bit rarer, and that only the truly desperate resorted to it. But one thing is for certain: the art of poisoning was something that people took very seriously. Poisons were often carefully researched, refined, and administered by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And once the poison was in the victim's system, there was little anyone could eat or do to stop it. Now, as you settle into your cozy bed and drift into sleep, imagine being in a world where poison was the ultimate tool of control. It wasn't just about power, it was about fear and control and playing a deadly game of chance. If you had a rival or a political enemy, you could quietly end their life without anyone ever knowing the true cause. And while we can look back on this era and shake our heads at the barbarity of it all, we also have to acknowledge the fact that, even today, poisoning is still a form of subtle, invisible power. Though we might not see it as much in modern life, the dark history of poison reminds us how much can be done behind the scenes without anyone ever knowing the true story. In a way, this whole practice makes you realize just how far we've come in terms of justice, medicine, and security. Today, we don't have to worry about poisoning being an everyday tool of politics and power. We've developed systems to protect ourselves from such threats. But the ancient and medieval world was a different time, a time when control was often exercised in the most secretive and deadly ways possible. And as you slip further into sleep, remember that while some things might change, others have remained eerily similar through the ages. But don't worry, no poisoners are likely lurking around your bedside tonight, so just relax and let sleep carry you away into more peaceful realms. As we continue to drift through the calm ebb of history, let's take a deep dive into one of the most notorious and grisly tools of execution ever devised, the guillotine. Now, the guillotine is widely known for its role during the French Revolution, but its origins and use stretch far beyond just the revolutionary period. It was a tool that made executions as efficient as they were terrifying, a method that would forever change how the world viewed justice and capital punishment. Though we often think of the guillotine as a device of quick and final judgment, its story is much more complex, and perhaps even more unsettling. The guillotine, often associated with the brutal and chaotic nature of the French Revolution, was originally conceived as a more humane method of execution. Yes, you read that right, humane. Before the invention of the guillotine, execution methods were horrific and varied. Beheadings were common, but often were carried out by axe or sword, which could be imprecise and required considerable skill. Imagine being the unfortunate soul waiting for the executioner to line up the axe perfectly. If they missed, you would be left in agony as they tried again. Or worse, they could hack at your body multiple times before finally succeeding. It was a grisly and drawn-out process that could sometimes take far longer than anyone wanted to witness. Enter the guillotine. The brainchild of Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, a French physician, it was designed to be a faster, more efficient, and more humane method of execution, particularly for those who had been convicted of crimes against the state. The guillotine was designed to ensure a quick and clean decapitation with a single stroke, eliminating the agonizing delays and risks of previous methods. The blade was heavy, the drop swift, and in theory it was supposed to be painless. Of course, whether or not it was truly pain-free remains a matter of debate. Historians still argue about how much awareness a person might retain in the moments following decapitation. The guillotine became the symbol of the French Revolution, particularly during the Reign of Terror, when thousands of people were executed for opposing the revolution. The blade fell relentlessly, almost as if it were a merciless clock ticking away the lives of anyone caught in its path. At the time, the guillotine was viewed as a necessary tool to rid society of enemies of the revolution. It was seen as swift, equal, and impartial. No matter your social class or standing, the guillotine did not discriminate. Kings, queens, commoners, it didn't matter. The blade came down on all equally. But the guillotine wasn't just an instrument of execution, it was also a tool of fear and control. Imagine living in a society where every day might be your last, where the distant sound of a guillotine's blade falling could echo through the streets, reminding you that anyone could be next. During the Reign of Terror, the guillotine became a symbol of the revolution's violence, a tool used to silence any opposition. It wasn't just the condemned who feared the guillotine. Even those who managed to survive the terror lived in constant dread of being next in line. In a way, the guillotine became the embodiment of the revolution itself, violent, unpredictable, and all-encompassing. And yet, as efficient and humane as the guillotine was, it was also a terrifying reflection of the brutal nature of the times. The constant beheadings became a spectacle in Paris. Crowds would gather to watch as people, some of them once powerful figures, were brought to their deaths in front of an audience. It became almost a public event, a grim form of entertainment for those who had no choice but to witness it. The idea of justice in the revolutionary era was distorted by the overwhelming fear of betrayal, where the execution of the guilty and innocent alike seemed to blur together. But as time went on, the guillotine lost its revolutionary appeal and became a symbol of the violence and chaos that had overtaken France. After the revolution ended, the guillotine was still used in France for executions, though by the mid-20th century it became a tool that would be used less and less frequently. In fact, the guillotine remained in use in France until 1977, making it one of the last countries to use such an iconic, albeit brutal, method of execution. The very idea that such a device could linger in modern times seems almost absurd, a lingering relic of an era that was, in many ways, defined by excess and extremism. Historians still argue over the lasting impact of the guillotine. Some see it as a necessary tool to facilitate the changes brought about by the revolution, something that was needed to enforce order during a time of chaos. Others argue that the guillotine symbolizes the darkness of human nature, the willingness to use extreme measures to enforce control and discipline. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. While it may have served its intended purpose of quickly and efficiently executing people, it also served to dehumanize and desensitize the public to the horrors of the violence that the revolution entailed. As you lay in bed, letting the world pass round you, quiet down. Think about the way history's darker elements sometimes find their way into public life. The guillotine may seem like an archaic relic now, but at the time it was seen as a necessary tool of justice. It was a time when life was cheap and death was not only inevitable but also public and brutal. Yet the guillotine was a sign of progress in a way, just a very dark and twisted kind of progress. But no matter how efficient the guillotine was, it can't escape the shadow of its history. It's a reminder of how justice can sometimes go awry, how power can be abused, and how the lines between order and chaos can sometimes blur in the pursuit of righteousness. So as you settle deeper into sleep, let this dark part of history fade into the background, knowing that what once seemed like an efficient tool for justice has become just another relic in a world that has moved on, thankfully with a little more humanity and a little less bloodshed. As you continue to slip deeper into relaxation, let's journey a bit further back in time to one of the most mysterious and debated deaths in history, the death of King Tutankhamun, the boy king of ancient Egypt. When King Tut passed away at just 18 or 19 years old, it sent shockwaves through Egypt, and for centuries, historians and archaeologists have been puzzled by the circumstances surrounding his death. Was it an accident, a murder, or perhaps something more mysterious like a curse? Let's explore the possibilities and see why this young king's death continues to captivate the world today. First, let's talk about the basics. King Tut was the pharaoh of Egypt from a very young age, just 9 years old. His reign was brief, but it's the circumstances of his death that have sparked debates and intrigue for thousands of years. When he died, the ancient Egyptians buried him with extraordinary care, sealing him in a tomb full of treasures. But here's the twist. The tomb was not as lavishly prepared as one might expect for a king. The tomb of King Tut was smaller and more hastily constructed compared to the tombs of other pharaohs, suggesting that something may have been rushed or done under duress. So what happened to the young ruler who seemed to have it all? Was it natural causes or something darker lurking in the background? For years, the official explanation was that King Tut died of an infection caused by a broken leg. This theory emerged after CT scans of his mummified body revealed evidence of a fractured leg, which some believed could have become infected and led to his untimely demise. But here's the thing. Recent studies have thrown doubt on this theory, suggesting that the broken leg may not have been the cause of death at all. Instead, some researchers believe that King Tut may have suffered from a genetic disorder, possibly passed down from his inbreed G-heavy royal family. This theory points to various signs of genetic malformations found in his mummified remains, which could have contributed to his early death. It's possible that his family's bloodline, rife with incestuous marriages in an attempt to preserve royal purity, might have played a role in the young king's fragile health. But the mystery doesn't end there. Some historians and Egyptologists have also suggested that King Tut was assassinated. The theory goes that his death was not the result of an accident or illness, but a deliberate plot to take the throne. The fact that his immediate successors were all family members adds weight to the theory that Tut's death could have been politically motivated. After all, there were power struggles and intrigue within the royal court, and the idea that a rival faction within the family could have orchestrated Tut's death to seize the throne isn't completely out of the question. Some even speculate that Tut's advisor, the powerful Vizier A, may have been involved in a conspiracy, but again there's no solid evidence, only theories and speculation. And here's where things get even more intriguing: the curse of the pharaohs. When King Tut's tomb was opened in 1922 by British archaeologist Howard Carter, a number of people associated with the excavation mysteriously died shortly afterward. This has fueled the belief in a curse, an ancient retribution for disturbing the resting places of Egypt's rulers. The idea of a curse has captured the public's imagination ever since, with stories of deaths, illnesses, and strange accidents following those involved in opening the tomb. Was it truly a curse, or just coincidence and bad luck? Some researchers believe that the deaths may have been related to the exposure to toxins in the tomb, such as mold, or perhaps even the stress of the media frenzy surrounding the discovery. The curse theory has become so ingrained in popular culture that it's easy to forget how much of King Tut's life and death remain a mystery. For centuries, the young king's life was largely unknown, and it wasn't until his tomb was uncovered that the world even remembered his name. Before Carter's discovery, Tut was little more than a footnote in the history of ancient Egypt. But now, King Tut has become one of the most famous pharaohs in history, not for his accomplishments during his reign, but for the intrigue surrounding his mysterious death and the sensational story of his tomb's discovery. Historians still argue over the cause of Tut's death, and the debate continues to this day. Some believe that modern science will eventually solve the mystery, while others argue that the truth may never be fully uncovered. The enigma of King Tut's life and death has fascinated generations, and it seems that no matter how much we uncover, there will always be a lingering question mark over his untimely demise. Was it an accident, illness, murder, or even a curse? The truth remains elusive, adding to the allure of one of history's greatest mysteries. As you start to drift even deeper into sleep, think about how strange and mysterious history can be. The life of a young boy king, whose reign was brief and largely uneventful, still manages to captivate the imagination of millions, and while the truth of his death may never be fully known, the stories and theories surrounding King Tut will continue to intrigue and fascinate, reminding us that even the most seemingly ordinary people can leave behind a legacy of mystery. So, as the history of this young pharaoh fades into the background of your mind, remember that some of the greatest stories we tell are those we can never fully explain. As the soft hum of history lulls you further into relaxation, let's journey to yet another peculiar chapter from the past, this time focusing on one of the more bizarre practices in the ancient world, the art of medieval dentistry. Now, we're used to a nice, clean dental checkup every 6 months, complete with fluoride treatments and possibly a shiny new filling. But in medieval times, well, let's just say the word dentist would have been more terrifying than helpful. Medieval dentistry, though it sounds like something out of a horror film, was in fact a crucial part of healthcare during those times. The idea of a professional dentist hadn't been invented yet, and dental procedures were typically carried out by barbers. Yes, those same individuals who were cutting hair, trimming beards, and performing minor surgeries. It wasn't unusual for your local barber to double as a dentist, wielding not just clippers and razors, but tools for extracting teeth and performing dental treatments. Imagine the confusion. You sit down in a barber's chair for a quick trim, and next thing you know, they're pulling out one of your molars without warning. It's almost like a game of chance, except your teeth were the prize. One of the most common dental procedures in the medieval world was tooth extraction. If a tooth hurt, the solution wasn't to fill the cavity or use a mild antiseptic, it was to rip it out, without anesthesia. The methods for extraction were rudimentary and sometimes shockingly painful, with the poor patient subjected to a crude process involving pliers or forceps. In fact, there are records of people having their teeth yanked out in a group setting, with the patient sitting on a chair while the barber or dentist would just pull the tooth with all their might. Think about that for a moment. You're in a room full of people, waiting your turn to lose a tooth. No novo. Cane, no sterilization, just you and a pair of pliers. But not all was lost, of course. If you were lucky, you might get the added bonus of a numbing agent made from concoctions like opium or alcohol, though these remedies weren't always effective. The idea of pain management was vastly underdeveloped, which meant that most people had to grin and bear the suffering. You might think that tooth extractions would be the worst of it, but the medieval world had an even more dreadful option: dental drilling. Now, before you freak out, imagine this. People during the medieval period sometimes used crude drills made from bows or hand-operated drills to remove decayed portions of teeth. These early drills weren't the smooth, high-speed devices we think of today. They were slow, methodical, and, as you can imagine, excruciatingly painful. To make matters worse, it wasn't uncommon for patients to develop infections in the area where their tooth was drilled or extracted, and with no antibiotics available, many people succumbed to those infections. In some cases, a simple cavity could lead to death. Still, if you managed to survive medieval dentistry, you could take solace in the fact that other civilizations were probably no better off. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, used rudimentary dental tools, sometimes fashioned from bronze, and they didn't have the luxury of fluoride toothpaste either. The tools were a far cry from what we use today, but they did have a few methods for handling dental pain, including using a form of early dental prosthetics to replace missing teeth. However, these prosthetics weren't quite as polished or effective as modern solutions like crowns or implants. Just imagine a crude version of a modern-day partial denture made from materials like ivory or bone, inserted into your mouth without the precision or comfort we've come to expect today. What's most interesting, though, is the cultural significance of teeth in medieval times. Missing teeth were not just seen as a medical problem, they also carried social implications. A person missing a tooth or several teeth might be seen as weak or poor, which is why dental hygiene, such as it was, became a matter of social status. Some wealthy individuals, for example, would opt for gold teeth or set their own dental work with precious stones to ensure that their smile was as dazzling as their reputation. Imagine that. A gleaming, gold-toothed grin was once considered the height of sophistication. So, while many of the medieval population struggled with cavities, extractions, and infection, the upper class made sure their smiles were anything but ordinary. You may be wondering how people coped with such severe dental challenges. Well, as unsettling as it sounds, many people simply accepted that they would have dental problems throughout their lives. And if your teeth became unbearably painful, there was always the option of a tooth puller, a professional whose sole job was to extract teeth, often without any anesthesia or care for the patient's comfort. The treatment wasn't limited to just dental extractions. Tooth pullers were also hired for their ability to fix a variety of dental problems, which could include misalignment, abscesses, and even tooth decay. However, they didn't have the ability to perform the delicate procedures we associate with modern dentistry. If you were lucky, your tooth would be pulled without too much pain, and if you were unlucky, the whole ordeal could be much more dangerous. As you sink into your pillow and let the soft, rhythmic beat of history lull you closer to sleep, it's wild to think about how far we've come in the realm of dental health. Today, we have cleanings, fillings, crowns, and sophisticated treatments like root canals. The idea of having your teeth pulled by someone who also cuts hair is now laughable. Yet back then, this was the best that people had, and many were just happy to make it through without an infection. Let this be a reminder of how lucky we are to have modern dentistry at our fingertips, where technology and understanding have made the pain of the past nearly a distant memory. The next time you're sitting in that comfy dentist's chair with a professional at your side, just take a moment to appreciate the fact that you're not in medieval Europe, gritting your teeth as someone prepares to pull them out with a pair of pliers. As we continue down this strange, sleepy path of history, let's move into another odd and unsettling episode from the past. The world of medieval witch trials. While today we may think of witch hunts as something from fairy tales or horror movies, in reality they were a very real and terrifying part of life for many people throughout Europe and the colonies, especially during the 15th and 16th centuries. Imagine living in a time when the very suspicion that you might be practicing witchcraft could lead to trial, torture, and execution. The fear of witches was pervasive, and those accused of being witches often found themselves in the most precarious and fatal of situations. Witch trials began in earnest during the medieval period, reaching their height during the 16th and 17th centuries. The idea behind the witch trial was simple. If someone was accused of practicing witchcraft, they were often presumed guilty unless they could prove their innocence, a near impossible feat. These trials were frequently based on flimsy or non-existent evidence, such as strange behavior, physical deformities, or simply being a woman living outside the norms of society. In many cases, accusations of witchcraft were driven by personal vendettas, jealous neighbours, or simply fear and superstition. If you were an outsider or just a bit different, you were often an easy target. One of the most famous witch trials took place in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, where a group of young girls accused several local women of practicing witchcraft. This incident became one of the most notorious examples of the hysteria surrounding witches, with over 200 people accused and 20 executed as a result of the trials. The accusations spiraled out of control, and soon even prominent members of the community were swept up in the frenzy. The Salem witch trials weren't just about witchcraft, they were a reflection of the deep societal fears and tensions that existed in the Puritan community at the time. In some cases, simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or even just being unpopular, could lead to an accusation, and once you were accused, the chance of surviving the trial was slim to none. But Salem was far from the only place where witch trials occurred. In fact, the trials were happening all over Europe long before the Salem Panic. In places like England, France, and Germany, witch trials were a terrifying and tragic reality. One of the most infamous witch trials was the Würzburg witch trial in Germany, which took place between 1626 and 1631. Over 900 people were executed, many of them tortured into confession. The trials became a monstrous wave of terror, fueled by the widespread belief that witches were in league with the devil, capable of casting spells, causing harm, and even killing people. The idea that witches could have such power led to a fervour of accusations, and once someone was accused, they were often tortured into confessing. These confessions were rarely voluntary, as the methods of torture were excruciating, and confessions often resulted in execution. You might wonder, how did people come to believe in the reality of witches and witchcraft in the first place? The fear of witches was often based on centuries of folklore, where witches were believed to possess supernatural powers. They were seen as women who had made pacts with the devil and who could cast spells, curse others, and summon demons. The church played a significant role in fueling these fears, often portraying witches as agents of evil and reinforcing the idea that anyone practicing witchcraft was in league with the devil. The witch hunts were, in many ways, a manifestation of the religious and social anxieties of the time. The rise of Christianity and its effort to solidify its power contributed to the widespread demonization of witches, especially women, as symbols of everything feared and misunderstood. The trials themselves were often chaotic and absurd. One common test used to determine whether someone was a witch was the swimming test. The accused would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were considered a witch because the water, supposedly pure, would reject them. If they sank, and as a result often drowned, they were presumed innocent, but dead. This test was far from logical, and it highlights just how irrational and based in fear the trials were. Imagine being in a world where something as ridiculous as floating in water could determine your life or death. Torture was also a common part of witch trials. To extract confessions, accused witches were often subjected to unimaginable cruelty. Stretching, whipping, burning, and other forms of physical abuse were used to make people confess. Those confessions, of course, were rarely truthful, but in the eyes of the accusers they were seen as evidence of guilt, and while we might now look at these practices with horror, at the time they were widely accepted as part of the search for justice. The societal consequences of these trials were devastating. Entire families could be wiped out if one member was accused of witchcraft, and entire communities were torn apart by the suspicion that anyone could be a witch. The fear of witchcraft was so pervasive that it infiltrated daily life. People began to distrust their neighbours, and it became easy for those with power to accuse those without of being witches. This created a climate of paranoia and terror that took centuries to undo. Thankfully, the witch trials eventually faded as people began to realise that the accusations were based on superstition and fear rather than fact. As you drift further into the soothing embrace of sleep, think about how a combination of fear, ignorance, and superstition can have a profound impact on society. The witch trials are a tragic reminder of how easily societies can become consumed by paranoia, and how innocent people can be destroyed by baseless accusations. The fact that so many lives were lost due to irrational fears is an awful thought, but it also serves as a powerful lesson in the importance of reason, empathy, and the need to question the things that are taken for granted. Perhaps most importantly, the witch trials show us how fear can turn even the most rational societies into places of chaos and cruelty. As you relax deeper into sleep, remember that history, while often dark and troubling, is filled with lessons that can help guide us through the present. The past, with all its flaws and mistakes, is not just a series of events, but a mirror reflecting our own struggles with fear, superstition, and injustice. And while it's important to remember these events, it's even more vital that we continue to grow beyond them, always striving to create a world where reason and compassion outweigh fear and ignorance. As we continue to drift even deeper into your slumber, let's glide into another curious chapter from history, this time focusing on one of the most notorious and debated deaths in history, the death of King Tutankhamun, the boy king of ancient Egypt. When King Tut passed away at just 18 or 19 years old, it sent shockwaves through Egypt, and for centuries historians and archaeologists have been puzzled by the circumstances surrounding his death. Was it an accident, a murder, or perhaps something more mysterious, like a curse? Let's explore the possibilities and see why this young king's death continues to captivate the world today. First, let's talk about the basics. King Tut was the pharaoh of Egypt from a very young age, just 9 years old. His reign was brief, but it's the circumstances of his death that have sparked debates and intrigue for thousands of years. When he died, the ancient Egyptians buried him with extraordinary care, sealing him in a tomb full of treasures. But here's the twist. The tomb was not as lavishly prepared as one might expect for a king. The tomb of King Tut was smaller and more hastily constructed compared to the tombs of other pharaohs, suggesting that something may have been rushed or done under duress. So, what happened to the young ruler who seemed to have it all? Was it natural causes or something darker lurking in the background? For years, the official explanation was that King Tut died of an infection caused by a broken leg. This theory emerged after CT scans of his mummified body revealed evidence of a fractured leg, which some believed could have become infected and led to his untimely demise. But here's the thing. Recent studies have thrown doubt on this theory, suggesting that the broken leg may not have been the cause of death at all. Instead, some researchers believe that King Tut may have suffered from a genetic disorder, possibly passed down from his inbreeding-heavy royal family. This theory points to various signs of genetic malformations found in his mummified remains which could have contributed to his early death. It's possible that his family's bloodline, rife with incestuous marriages in an attempt to preserve royal purity, might have played a role in the young king's fragile health. But the mystery doesn't end there. Some historians and Egyptologists have also suggested that King Tut was assassinated. The theory goes that his death was not the result of an accident or illness, but a deliberate plot to take the throne. The fact that his immediate successors were all family members adds weight to the theory that Tut's death could have been politically motivated. After all, there were power struggles and intrigue within the royal court, and the idea that a rival faction within the family could have orchestrated Tut's death to seize the throne isn't completely out of the question. Some even speculate that Tut's advisor, the powerful Vizier A, may have been involved in a conspiracy. But again, there's no solid evidence, only theories and speculation. And here's where things get even more intriguing. The curse of the pharaohs. When King Tut's tomb was opened in 1922 by British archaeologist Howard Carter, a number of people associated with the excavation mysteriously died shortly afterward. This has fueled the belief in a curse, an ancient retribution for disturbing the resting places of Egypt's rulers. The idea of a curse has captured the public's imagination ever since, with stories of deaths, illnesses, and strange accidents following those involved in opening the tomb. Was it truly a curse, or just coincidence and bad luck? Some researchers believe that the deaths may have been related to the exposure to toxins in the tomb, such as mold, or perhaps even the stress of the media frenzy surrounding the discovery. The curse theory has become so ingrained in popular culture that it's easy to forget how much of King Tut's life and death remain a mystery. For centuries, the young king's life was largely unknown, and it wasn't until his tomb was uncovered that the world even remembered his name. Before Carter's discovery, Tut was little more than a footnote in the history of ancient Egypt. But now, King Tut has become one of the most famous pharaohs in history, not for his accomplishments during his reign, but for the intrigue surrounding his mysterious death and the sensational story of his tomb's discovery. Historians still argue over the cause of Tut's death, and the debate continues to this day. Some believe that modern science will eventually solve the mystery, while others argue that the truth may never be fully uncovered. The enigma of King Tut's life and death has fascinated generations, and it seems that no matter how much we uncover, there will always be a lingering question mark over his untimely demise. Was it an accident, illness, murder, or even a curse? The truth remains elusive, adding to the allure of one of history's greatest mysteries. As you start to drift even deeper into sleep, think about how strange and mysterious history can be. The life of a young boy king whose reign was brief and largely uneventful still manages to captivate the imagination of millions. And while the truth of his death may never be fully known, the stories and theories surrounding King Tut will continue to intrigue and fascinate, reminding us that even the most seemingly ordinary people can leave behind a legacy of mystery. So, as the history of this young pharaoh fades into the background of your mind, remember that some of the greatest stories we tell are those we can never fully explain. As you begin to sink deeper into the comfort of sleep, let's venture into another strange chapter of history, the fascinating world of mummy trading during the Victorian era. While we might think of mummies as solemn relics of ancient Egypt, in the 19th century, they were viewed as something quite different. Mummies became a bizarre commodity, not for study or respect, but for entertainment, medicine, and even decor. The Victorian obsession with Egypt and its ancient secrets went far beyond the academic. Mummies were dug up, bought, sold, and unwrapped, sometimes in front of eager audiences, as a form of strange entertainment. So let's unravel this eerie chapter of history where the dead were treated as mere objects of fascination. The fascination with Egypt was at an all-time high in the Victorian era. With the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the growing popularity of Egyptology, the West became obsessed with all things Egyptian. This wasn't just about studying ancient civilizations, though. It was a craze that saw the humble mummy transformed from a sacred relic to an exotic curiosity. Rather than focusing on archaeological significance, mummies were often seen as commodities to be traded, dissected, and even put on public display. Mummy unwrapping parties became fashionable in wealthy circles, where guests would gather, eager to witness the unwrapping of an ancient corpse as if it were the grand reveal of an art piece or a new scientific discovery. But it wasn't just about curiosity. The fascination with mummies reached a bizarre and macabre level, with some Victorians believing that mummies had medicinal properties. Yes, you heard that right. Mummy powder made from ground-up mummies was believed to have healing powers. It was sold as a remedy for various ailments, from headaches to stomach issues. The idea that consuming ground-up ancient bodies could cure illness was seen as legitimate at the time. Mummy powder was even advertised in apothecaries, where it was touted as a cure-all for anything from internal bleeding to epilepsy. Of course, this was all based on superstition and a profound misunderstanding of science. But it was a booming trade, nonetheless. The ancient Egyptians had unknowingly become a source of medical miracles in the minds of Victorians. But if you thought the use of mummies as medicine was strange, the way they were treated as entertainment takes the bizarre factor even further. Mummy unwrapping parties were lavish events held by the wealthy in their grand homes, with an audience of curious onlookers eager to witness the dramatic process of unwrapping. The event would often be accompanied by a lecture on Egyptology, with the mummy carefully laid out for all to see. It was an odd mix of science and spectacle, a strange form of public amusement where the dead were paraded as entertainment for the living. Mummies were often seen as curiosities to be admired, dissected, and even joked about. The fact that the bodies being unwrapped were once part of an ancient sacred civilization seemed to matter little to the Victorians. What mattered was the spectacle of it all. At the heart of this fascination was the idea of Egypt as a land of mystery, full of secrets and untold wisdom. The Victorians, in their hunger for knowledge and the unknown, began to treat mummies as a way of unlocking ancient truths. They believed that by studying the mummified remains, they could tap into the lost knowledge of a powerful and mystical civilization. Some even went so far as to believe that by unwrapping and analyzing the bodies, they could somehow communicate with the spirits of the past. In the minds of many, mummies were not just dead bodies, they were vessels of untapped wisdom, waiting to be opened and understood. But as you may guess, the trade in mummies didn't come without its darker side. The process of obtaining mummies often involved desecrating tombs and robbing graves. Egypt's ancient burial sites were looted by tomb raiders, and mummies were unearthed without any regard for the sanctity of the tomb or the religious beliefs that had governed their burial. In fact, the demand for mummies was so high that Egyptian authorities often found themselves unable to stop the illegal excavations. Mummies were sold across Europe with no consideration for their historical significance, and for the people who lived in those lands, these ancient remains were seen more as an exotic commodity than as a link to a rich cultural past. It wasn't just about the preservation of history. Mummies were also prized for their wrappings. The linen used in mummification was of high quality, and it was often repurposed for things like clothing or even wallpaper. Victorians, in their obsessive desire to collect artifacts from Egypt, would take the wrappings and turn them into decorative items, using them as part of their home decor. Imagine stepping into a lavish Victorian home and noticing that the very wallpaper or curtains you were admiring were once wrapped around. An ancient body, preserved for millennia. It's enough to make you question just how far the line between respect and exploitation can blur when history becomes a commodity. The entire mummy craze of the Victorian era was part of a larger trend of Western fascination with the exotic. Egypt was viewed not just as a land of history, but as a land of mystery, full of secrets that the West was eager to uncover. Mummies were part of that mystery, and for many Victorians, owning or viewing one was seen as a way of possessing a piece of the ancient world. It wasn't about reverence for the past, it was about an insatiable thirst for the unknown, for things that couldn't be fully understood but could be enjoyed nonetheless. And yet, as the years went by, the public's fascination with mummies began to wane. As Egyptology developed into a more serious and respectful academic discipline, the practice of unwrapping mummies as entertainment and selling them for bizarre uses slowly faded away. Today, most mummies are carefully preserved and studied with great respect, and their sale as commodities is no longer tolerated. However, the strange and morbid fascination that the Victorians had with these ancient bodies remains a reminder of how history can sometimes be treated with the same casualness as any other curiosity. As you relax deeper into your slumber, think of the mummies once subjected to such exploitation and intrigue, now safely preserved in museums where they can be studied with dignity. The lesson here is that we must always be mindful of how we treat the past, because even the smallest curiosity can sometimes reveal something much larger than we first imagined. As you drift even deeper into the tranquil arms of sleep, let's turn the page to a curious and troubling chapter of history, the story of the Great London Smog of 1952. Imagine, if you will, walking through the streets of London, your steps muffled by a thick yellowish haze that seems to swallow the city whole. The cold air bites at your skin, but it's the strange oppressive fog that makes it difficult to breathe, and your eyes sting with irritation. You glance around and see the outlines of buildings shrouded in mist, traffic moving sluggishly, and people stumbling half-blind, trying to make their way through the gloom. You might think this is some kind of horror movie scene, but in reality, it was all too real. The Great London Smog, also known as the Big Smoke, was one of the most catastrophic environmental disasters in the UK's history. It occurred in December of 1952 and lasted for about 5 days, during which time a thick layer of smog descended upon London. But this was no ordinary fog. It was a toxic, suffocating mixture of smoke, sulfur dioxide and other pollutants, exacerbated by a cold weather front that trapped the smog over the city like a lid on a pot. It was a time when the streets were blanketed in such dense fog that visibility was reduced to mere feet, and the smell of burning coal and sulphur hung in the air. It wasn't just a nuisance, it was a deadly menace. What made this smog particularly lethal was the combination of industrial pollution, coal burning for home heating, and a weather pattern known as a temperature inversion. Under normal conditions, warm air rises and disperses pollutants in the atmosphere, but during the temperature inversion, cold air settled near the ground, trapping pollutants in the city. This thick fog was not just a fog, it was a toxic cloud composed of soot, coal smoke, and chemicals from factories and vehicles. The resulting pollution was so intense that people had trouble breathing. Many simply couldn't see where they were going. The smog grew so dense that it even affected the city's public transport, grounding buses, trains, and flights. The city's iconic black cabs and streetcars couldn't travel easily, leaving Londoners trapped in their own homes and a helpless, suffocating atmosphere hanging over the city. By the time the smog finally lifted, it was too late. The exact number of casualties is debated, but it's estimated that around 4,000 people died directly from the effects of the smog. Many of them were elderly or had pre-existing respiratory conditions, but the smog contributed to thousands of additional deaths from pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lung diseases. The true toll may never be fully known. Thousands more were hospitalized with respiratory problems, and the effects were felt across the city for weeks afterward. The smog was a silent killer, an environmental catastrophe that people couldn't escape from. It was one of those rare moments in history when the very air you breathe becomes a threat to your life, an invisible but deadly enemy. What makes this event all the more tragic is that it could have been prevented. The Great London Smog was a direct result of the city's reliance on coal for heating and industrial purposes, and the lack of regulations to curb air pollution. Coal burning was a major part of daily life, and people thought little about the dangers of air pollution. Industrial factories were spewing toxins into the air, and in many households coal fires were used for heating, contributing to the deadly mixture of smoke and fumes. It wasn't until the 1950s that people started to realize the full extent of the damage that industrial pollution could cause to public health, and the disaster of the Great Smog prompted significant changes in environment or policy. In the wake of the tragedy, the UK government took steps to address air pollution. One of the key pieces of legislation that came out of the aftermath was the Clean Air Act of 1956, which introduced measures to reduce smoke emissions in the city and required homes to switch from coal to cleaner forms of heating. The Act also led to the creation of designated smoke control areas and mandated the use of smokeless fuels. While the legislation was a step forward, it was a stark reminder that even the most basic everyday practices, like heating your home, could have far-reaching, lethal consequences. The Great London Smog of 1952 serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked industrialisation and the impact of pollution on human health. It's a chapter in history that's all too easy to forget until we're faced with similar environmental challenges today. Air pollution is still a major issue in many parts of the world, and while we have made significant strides in reducing emissions and improving air quality, the London smog was a clear warning of what can happen when pollution is allowed to spiral out of control. As you settle deeper into your restful state, think about the lessons this tragedy teaches us. We've come a long way since 1952, but the memory of that dark, toxic fog should remind us of the importance of environmental responsibility and the need to take care of our planet. The world we live in today is far from perfect, but the efforts to protect the environment and improve air quality have made significant strides in reducing the impact of pollution. It's a reminder that the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the world around us must be treated with care and respect, not just for our generation, but for generations to come. And as you slip deeper into sleep, let that thought settle in the quiet of the night where all is still and the air is fresh. Think of the London smog as a reminder to appreciate the simple things like clean air and to do what we can to ensure that future generations can breathe easy too. As you let the quietude of the night embrace you, we move on to another fascinating and often overlooked part of history, the invention of the subway system. Now, you might think of modern subways as a convenient part of daily life, something we use without giving much thought. But believe it or not, the story of the subway is packed with trials, difficulties, and surprising innovations, all of which make its birth in the 19th century an incredibly significant and at times downright funny chapter in the tale of modern cities. So let's step back in time and explore how the first subway systems came to be, and the rather quirky challenges they had to overcome. The year was 1863, and London was a bustling metropolis, its streets packed with horse-drawn carriages, carts and pedestrians. But with the city growing at an exponential rate, getting around had become an increasingly difficult and, let's be honest, miserable task. Traffic congestion was a nightmare. People would find themselves stuck for hours in traffic jams, breathing in smog, and slowly realizing that their daily commute might as well have been a journey to the underworld itself. A solution was needed, and it needed to be bold, new, and underground. In steps the world's first underground train system, the Metropolitan Railway in London. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of building more roads for the city's ever-growing population of horse-drawn carriages, why not take the transportation system underground? It sounded like science fiction, but in 1863 it was the cutting edge of engineering. A train that could move beneath the streets without contributing to the traffic chaos above. It was an idea that made the city's leaders sit up and take notice. The construction of the first subway was anything but smooth sailing, however. Building a tunnel under a bustling city was no easy task. First off, there were no fancy machines like we have today, no tunneling machines, no modern engineering techniques to help them dig. Instead, workers had to rely on pickaxes, shovels, and brute strength to carve out tunnels beneath the city. Picture it, thousands of workers, underground with limited light, chipping away at the earth with nothing but their hands and a bit of elbow grease. It was dirty, dangerous work. And sadly, a fair number of workers lost their lives to accidents in the early days of construction. Then, of course, there was the issue of ventilation. The air underground, where trains would soon rumble through the tunnels, could quickly become stifling, filled with smoke from the coal-powered engines. Early on, the trains themselves added to the mess, spewing coal smoke into the tunnels. This created a less than pleasant experience for passengers, who would find themselves coughing and struggling to breathe as they made their way beneath the city. Imagine heading underground to escape the chaos of the streets, only to find yourself choked by smoke. Talk about a transportation fail. And yet, despite all these challenges, the Metropolitan Railway opened on January the 10th, 1863, with great fanfare. The first passengers were a mix of curious Londoners, city officials, and wealthy elites eager to experience this new marvel of modern technology. The trains, though coal-powered and smoky, were an instant hit. People marvelled at how much faster and more comfortable the ride was compared to navigating the crowded streets above. Within a few years, the idea of underground transport spread to other cities, like New York, Paris, and eventually Tokyo, all of which built their own subway systems. But what makes the subway's history truly fascinating is the sheer scale of the challenges it overcame. As cities grew, subway systems had to grow with them. For example, the New York City subway, which opened in 1904, quickly became the world's largest and busiest public transit system, moving millions of people a day. But even in New York, the growth of the subway was far from simple. Overcrowded trains, broken tracks, and questionable design choices, such as some stations being located way too deep underground, made for a chaotic early history. It wasn't uncommon for people to find themselves crammed into trains so tightly that they could hardly move. The idea of personal space was out the window. And then there's the humorous fact that in the early days, the subway was mostly designed for the wealthy. While the system was certainly more efficient than above-ground travel, the affluent were often the first to use it, with the working class being being somewhat excluded from the luxury. There was a social element to the early subway system that you wouldn't expect. Trains were segregated by class, with the best seats reserved for the elite. And despite being designed for convenience, some stations had entrances that were so narrow or poorly located that it took ages to get to your train. Imagine being in a rush, only to realise that your subway station was designed with the complete opposite goal in mind. Over time, though, the subway systems in cities like London and New York became more inclusive, efficient, and comfortable. Modern subways today are marvels of engineering, featuring clean, automated trains, air conditioning, and even Wi-Fi. It's a far cry from those early, coal-filled tunnels, and the work that went into making them such an essential part of city life is a testament to the ingenuity of those who risked everything to make urban life easier. It's easy to forget that we take this form of transportation for granted today. After all, what's a trip underground in an air-conditioned car compared to the smoky, cramped tunnels of 19th century London? As you ease into a deeper sleep, think about the persistence it took to build these tunnels beneath bustling cities, to create the infrastructure that now seamlessly transports millions every day. It wasn't always smooth, and it wasn't always pretty, but it was one of the first true steps toward modern urban life as we know it. The subway system was born out of necessity, and its growth is a beautiful, if somewhat strange, reflection of how we adapt and innovate to overcome the problems of the past. Tonight, let the hum of the trains fade away in your dreams as you imagine yourself travelling through time and space, perhaps deep beneath the streets of London or through the tunnels of New York, where every train is a link between history and the future. Now that you're deep in rest, wrapped in blankets and barely tethered to the waking world, let's ease into one of history's stranger social rituals, the witch trials and medieval justice system. This wasn't the swift, evidence-based system we expect today. Instead, it was a chaotic blend of superstition, religion, folk tradition, and fear, all rolled into one messy package. You might imagine grand trials, gavel-pounding judges, and compelling arguments. But no. This was the age of ducking stools, trial by ordeal, and confessions wrung out through less than voluntary means. Let's begin with a scene. Picture a small 16th century village, fog rolling through crooked cobblestone streets, townspeople whispering nervously outside timber-framed houses. Someone's cow has stopped producing milk, or a child has fallen mysteriously ill. People need an explanation, and fast. So, naturally, they blame the odd woman who lives on the edge of the village, keeps too many cats, and talks to her herbs like they're old friends. Accusation, witchcraft, proof, don't need it. Suspicion alone will do. You see, in this era, the very accusation of witchcraft was almost as good as a conviction, and what followed was often brutal, sometimes bizarre, and rarely fair. One of the most infamous tests was the swimming test. It worked like this. The accused would be tied up and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, it was considered evidence that they had rejected baptism and were in league with the devil, clearly a witch. If they sank, they were innocent, but often dead. So, essentially, it was a lose-lose game where your best hope was to survive the accusation long enough to beg for mercy or confess. And these so-called trials were not limited to remote villages or illiterate peasants. Monarchs, church leaders, and political powers all fanned the flames. In 1486, a book titled Malleus Male, Apothecarum, the Hammer of Witches, was published by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor. It was essentially a how-to guide for identifying, trying, and executing witches. This book was taken very seriously for centuries. Its logic, flawed. Its science, non-existent. Its influence, immense. Historians still argue whether it created more hysteria than it resolved. In many ways, it poured gasoline on already blazing fires. Witch hunts weren't confined to one country either. They swept across Europe. In Germany, France, Switzerland, England, and Scotland, thousands were tried and executed. One of the deadliest was the Würzburg witch trials in the 1620s, where nearly 1,000 people were executed. Yes, 1,000. Many were women, but men, children, and even clergy were accused. These weren't just fringe cases. Entire communities were swept into these panics. In some towns, it seemed no one was safe. Paranoia ruled. And then there's Salem, the small Puritan settlement in Massachusetts, where in 1692 a cluster of young girls accused several people of witchcraft. Fueled by fear, politics, and religious extremism, a cascade of trials and executions followed. 19 people were hanged, one man was pressed to death with stones, yes, pressed, and many others languished in jail. The Salem witch trials are infamous not just for their horror, but for the strange evidence used. Spectral evidence, dreams and visions were considered valid. One girl's word that she'd seen your spirit floating above her bed could land you on trial. Yet, even at the height of hysteria, there were skeptics. Some judges began to question the validity of the trials. Ministers cautioned against using invisible evidence. And gradually, reason began to creep in. The trials slowed, then stopped, and society, ever so slowly, moved on. Still, the damage was done. Thousands had been tortured, imprisoned, or killed across Europe and the American colonies. But maybe the most chilling part, the belief that witches were real and that they walked among us, was taken as fact. These were not metaphorical battles. To the people of the time, these were desperate attempts to protect their souls, their children, and their crops from what they saw as a genuine and present evil. Even more unsettling, witchcraft trials weren't just about fear of the supernatural. They were often used to control people, particularly women. A woman who was independent, unmarried, outspoken, or simply different was a prime target. It was an early form of societal enforcement. Behave how we expect, or else. Historians still debate whether the trials were more about religious dogma or patriarchal suppression. Either way, they served as a grim tool for enforcing conformity. And while you might be thinking, surely this couldn't happen today, consider how society still marginalizes those it doesn't understand. The witch hunts of the past serve as both a dark memory and a warning about the danger of mass hysteria, scapegoating, and blind belief. So, as you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, think of those long ago nights when communities trembled under the weight of suspicion and superstition. Imagine the hush that would fall over a village when the word witch was whispered. And then be grateful, for the world may still be strange, but at least we no longer throw people in rivers to see if they float. Now, as you gently float in the calm current of near sleep, let's sink into a more tranquil part of the past, one that involves water, relaxation, and just a hint of historical oddity, the rise and fall of the Roman baths. While other parts of history have been grim or grotesque, Roman baths were, in a strange way, a luxurious escape. Yet even these seemingly civilized spaces were full of strange customs, questionable health practices, and social dynamics that make them fascinating and a little weird by modern standards. The Roman bath was more than just a place to clean your body. It was a cultural institution. By the 2nd century CE, nearly every major Roman city had at least one public bathhouse called a thermae, and often several. These weren't just oversized bathtubs, they were complex buildings with pools of various temperatures, steam rooms, saunas, massage areas, and even gyms. Yes, the Romans figured out how to create the world's first wellness centers long before you could book a spa day through an app. And the best part, it was dirt cheap. In many cases, entry was free or cost just a few coins, which made it accessible to citizens of all social classes. Emperors and beggars alike could soak in the same water, though not necessarily at the same time. Bathing in ancient Rome was a daily ritual. Romans believed strongly in the connection between physical cleanliness and moral virtue. A trip to the baths wasn't just about hygiene, it was about health, socializing, business, gossip, and even politics. Picture this. You're lounging in a steamy caldarium, hot bath, discussing real estate deals with a senator, eavesdropping on a scandalous affair in the next pool, and keeping a sharp eye on the man trying to steal your sandals. It was equal parts networking, skincare, and community drama. The bath experience typically followed a routine. You'd start in the apothecaries, changing room, store your belongings, often with the help of a slave or attendant, and proceed to the tepidarium, a warm room to ease you in. Then came the caldarium, a hot and steamy room with heated pools, and finally the frigidarium, a cold plunge pool to close the pores and revive the senses. This hot-cold-hot transition was considered invigorating and was believed to balance the body's humours. Some bathhouses even had libraries and snack vendors nearby, making the experience an all-day event. Think of it as the Roman version of going to the gym, reading in a cafe and hitting the sauna, just with a few more togas. But Roman baths weren't always pristine. For all their elegance and engineering brilliance, the water was not frequently changed. Most bathhouses lacked proper filtration systems, and without chlorine or sanitation procedures, the pools could become murky. And let's just say well-seasoned. Add to that the fact that hundreds of people used them daily, and it becomes pretty clear that these elegant facilities were also hotbeds for germs. Historians still argue whether the baths did more harm than good, health-wise. Some claim the warm water promoted skin infections, while others believe the psychological and social benefits outweighed the risks. Hygiene practices at the baths were also inventive. Instead of soap, Romans used strigils, curved metal scrapers, to remove oil, dirt, and sweat from their skin. Before entering the baths, they'd coat themselves in olive oil and then scrape it off along with all the gunk. These scrapers weren't disposable either. Some were shared, and occasionally attendants would reuse the oil-sweat mixture on multiple people. So if you were hoping for a spa-like cleanse, what you got was more like a communal exfoliation. Despite these quirks, the baths were places of relative equality, at least in terms of public access. Men and women had separate hours or spaces depending on the bathhouse, and for many it was the only place they could enjoy leisure time outside their cramped homes. That said, bathhouses were also places of hierarchy. Rich Romans flaunted their jewelry and slaves, the poor kept their heads down and their feet tucked in. Theft was common, and while physical nudity was normalized, social nakedness, confessing your failures or being caught without a servant was another story entirely. The fall of the Roman baths coincided with the fall of the empire itself. As Rome's infrastructure decayed and Christian values gained influence, public bathing began to be viewed as sinful, indulgent, and even dangerous. Water systems crumbled, aqueducts dried up, and the once grand thermae were abandoned. By the time the medieval era rolled in, communal bathing was largely replaced by buckets and prayers. Some even believed that too much washing could open the body to illness. So, ironically, Europe's Dark Ages were also its dirtiest. Still, the legacy of Roman baths is everywhere, from the spas of modern Europe to Turkish hammams and Japanese onsens. Their impact ripples through time like warm water in a stone basin. The Roman approach to public bathing reminds us that self-care, even in ancient times, wasn't a luxury, it was a lifestyle. So tonight, as you drift off into deeper sleep, imagine yourself in a candlelit tepidarium, your body warm and relaxed, steam rising gently in the air, the murmurs of conversation echoing softly around you. The stone beneath you is warm, the scent of oil lingers in the air, and for just a moment, you are a Roman citizen, lost in a timeless ritual of rest. As you melt into the last layer of sleep's warm cocoon, it's only fitting that we end our long and winding journey through history with a quiet, timeless subject: how past civilizations envisioned death and the afterlife, or, as you might think of it tonight, the final sleep. While death is often portrayed as something dark or frightening, many ancient cultures saw it as something else entirely, a natural transition, a bridge to something peaceful, even beautiful. In many cases, they prepared for it with more care and ceremony than they did for birth. Let's begin with the ancient Egyptians, who turned death into a full-time job. Their obsession with the afterlife wasn't born of fear, but of deep reverence. To the Egyptians, death wasn't an end, it was a continuation, a passage to the field of reeds where the soul would enjoy peace, plenty, and perhaps a nice cold beer forever. But only if you played your cards right. That's why tombs were meticulously prepared, filled with items the deceased might need: food, tools, perfumes, board games, even pets. You've probably seen images of lavish sarcophagi and gold masks, but the real charm is in the smaller details: a comb for grooming, a loaf of bread for hunger, a tiny painted cat to keep you company. Then, of course, came mummification, a preservation ritual designed to keep the body intact for use in the next world. It was believed that the body and soul would reunite, so you had to take care of both. And if your heart was found heavier than a feather in the afterlife's final judgment, sorry, you didn't pass. You'd be devoured by a terrifying crocodile-lion-hippo hybrid named Amit. But if you passed, eternal bliss awaited. Meanwhile, in ancient China, elaborate burial practices reflected a similar belief in continuity. Emperors were buried in sprawling underground cities, complete with clay soldiers, horses, weapons, and daily items. The terracotta army, guarding the tomb of China's first emperor Qin Shi Huang, stands as one of the most breathtaking tributes to the afterlife ever conceived. The idea wasn't just to remember the dead, it was to equip them as if they were going on the longest business trip of all time. The Vikings, on the other hand, believed in dying with style. A warrior's death in battle was the golden ticket to Valhalla, a majestic hall of eternal feasting and battle. For those less battle-inclined, there was Hell, a quieter place. Not quite as fun, but not as terrifying as its name might suggest. Fun fact, Viking ships weren't just for sailing. Some were used as floating coffins, set alight and pushed out to sea as flaming funerals. It's theatrical, it's poetic, and probably very bad for the fjords. The Romans had their own practical spin on the afterlife. They often buried their dead outside city walls, lining roads with tombs like milestones to eternity. Inscriptions would plead with passers-by, "Do not disturb the sleep of the dead." Death was seen as a kind of eternal rest, but still tied to the living world through rituals and memory. Families would celebrate the dead during annual festivals like Parentalia, offering food and drink at the graveside. Even in death, one could still be invited to dinner, just in a less conversational capacity. In medieval Europe, death was more fearful. Plagues, famine and war made it feel ever-present. The church dominated beliefs about the afterlife, emphasizing the importance of confession and penance. Heaven, hell and purgatory became central concepts, and funerals were solemn affairs filled with incense, Latin prayers, and the hope that your soul wouldn't get stuck in the spiritual waiting room. But even amid this religious weight, there was comfort, the idea that death was a reunion with loved ones, a place of divine peace for those who had suffered. Curiously, Tibetan Buddhist funerals embraced impermanence in a way that might surprise you. Bodies were sometimes offered to vultures in what's known as a sky burial, returning the body to nature so that nothing went to waste. It was a stark, honest acceptance of the life-death cycle. Death wasn't something to fear, but something to acknowledge and flow with. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the soul journeys through various stages, ultimately seeking release from suffering, The ritual is less about grief, more about transformation. Even in modern times, we see echoes of ancient rituals, cemeteries designed like gardens, urns filled with keepsakes, eulogies full of life stories. In Mexico's Dia de los Muertos, the dead are remembered with laughter, marigolds, music, and altars full of food. The boundary between the living and the departed is softened, not severed. It's a sleep with a guest list. Historians still argue whether funeral rituals reveal more about the dead or the living. Some say burial practices are a reflection of status and power. Others insist they're acts of love, memory, and continuity. Either way, they remind us that death has always been part of life, a shadow that, when accepted, makes the light feel warmer. And now, as you drift into your own safe sleep, think of those quiet tombs beneath the Iwas. Breath, the gentle flicker of candles at shrines, the whisper of a breeze through ancient graveyards. Imagine a place where the worries of the world have faded away and everything is calm, still, and at peace. Now, let your breath slow. Let your body soften like ancient linen tucked inside a quiet sarcophagus. The stories we've travelled through tonight, tales of smog and subways, plagues and potions, birds at war and whispering tombs, are behind you now. All the strange, sleepy chapters of history fade like mist from a forgotten field. There's nothing to do now, nowhere to go, just the steady rhythm of your breath and the hush of your thoughts. Let your limbs feel heavy, like sun-warmed stones. Let your mind loosen its grip on the day. Let go of the noise, the to-do lists, the headlines. They'll wait. They always do. You are floating now, wrapped in time, adrift in the soft fog between memory and dream. Maybe you'll wander through ancient ruins tonight. Maybe you'll take a subway ride through a Roman bathhouse or get lost in the misty alleys of old London. Or maybe you'll sleep so deeply you'll remember none of it. That's okay too. History has its noise, its drama, its disasters, but right now it's just a lullaby, and you're part of it too. A quiet soul at rest beneath the stars, listening to the echoes of the past, humming you to sleep. So go ahead, let go, let sleep take you.